The moment Nellie Yates pressed her needle through the wool of that torn coat and felt the rough, road-worn texture of it beneath her fingertips, she had no way of knowing it would change the entire course of her life. The town of Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878 was not the kind of place a woman built dreams. It was a cattle town, sitting fat and restless on the edge of the Kishom Trail, where longhorns raised dust clouds that turned the sky the color of rust and cowboys rode in smelling of sweat and leather and weeks of open prairie. It was the kind of place where a woman either married young or worked herself old, and Nellie Yates, 24 years of age with clever hands and sharper eyes, had chosen neither path precisely. She had chosen the needle. Her shop sat on the east side of Main Street, wedged between the barber and the telegraph office, and the sign above the door read simply, N. Yates, Seamstress and Alterations. It was a modest sign for a modest shop, but the work she did inside those walls was anything but modest. Nellie could let out a seam or take one in with the kind of precision that made the men of Caldwell stand a little straighter when they walked out her door. She could fashion a dress from 3 yards of calico that made a woman look like she just stepped off a train from St. Louis. She had a gift, plain and honest as the Kansas sky, and she protected that gift the way other women protected fine china. She had come to Caldwell 3 years prior, following her Aunt Margaret, who had since passed from a fever that swept through town in the summer of 1876. Nellie had stayed on, inheriting the shop space and the small room above it, and had built something out of nothing, the way women of that era often had to. She had no father to speak of, having lost him crossing the Missouri River when she was 12, and her mother had remarried a man in Ohio who smelled of pipe smoke and indifference. So Caldwell was hers, in the way that places become yours when you have no better option and you decide to love them anyway. On the particular Tuesday morning when everything began, Nellie was repairing the hem on Mrs. Garrison's Sunday dress and humming something low under her breath, a habit she had when she worked. The shop smelled of cedar and sizing starch, and the faint sweetness of the lavender she kept in a dried bundle near the window. Outside, the trail dust was already kicking up, and she could hear the distant sound of cattle lowing somewhere south of town. The bell above her door rang. She did not look up immediately. Customers came and went, and she had learned not to rush her needle on account of a bell. "I'll be with you directly," she said, finishing the stitch she was on and tying it off with the practiced efficiency of someone who had sewn 10,000 stitches before breakfast. When she finally looked up, there was a man standing in her doorway who did not quite fit. He was tall, which she noticed first, with the kind of height that made him have to angle his hat slightly sideways to clear the frame. He had dark hair that curled a little at the ends, damp from where he'd clearly run water through it before coming in, as if he had thought about making himself presentable and then only half succeeded. His jaw was dark with several days of trail stubble, and his eyes, when they met hers across the small space of the shop, were a quiet, steady brown that reminded her of still creek water. He was holding a coat. It was a brown canvas work coat, the kind that cattlemen wore through every season from hard spring to bitter fall, and it had a tear along the left shoulder seam that was so dramatic it looked almost intentional. The entire sleeve was pulling away from the body of the coat, held on now by perhaps a dozen strands of thread and stubbornness alone. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who spent most of his time outdoors where there was no need to raise it. "I was told you could fix about anything." "Who told you that?" Nellie asked, already standing and moving toward him, because the coat was drawing her either way a bad wound draws a doctor. "Fella at the livery. Said you were the best seamstress between here and Wichita." "The fella at the livery is Jim Dorsey, and Jim Dorsey has never once in his life been to Wichita," she said, but she was already taking the coat from his hands, turning it over in her own, examining the tear with her fingers. She pressed her thumb along the seam line. The canvas itself was intact, which was fortunate. The thread had simply given out, probably yanked hard by something, A fence post or a saddle horn or any of the 100 ways a man on the trail could tear a coat without noticing until it was nearly falling off him. "Can you fix it?" he asked. "I can fix it," she said. She looked up at him. "I can fix anything that wants to be fixed. What's your name?" There was a brief pause, as if the question surprised him slightly. "Louis Haskins." "Mr. Haskins, I'm Nellie Yates. This will cost you 30 cents and I can have it ready by Thursday morning." He reached up and touched the back of his neck in a way that seemed almost self-conscious. "I was kind of hoping for sooner. I've got work tomorrow." "You can wear your shirt tomorrow," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment, and she noticed that he did not seem offended by her bluntness, which was unusual. Most men expected a woman to be softer around the edges when she spoke to them. Louis Haskins just nodded slowly, as if he were filing away something interesting. "Thursday then," he said. She wrote his name in her ledger and he left, and the bell rang again as the door closed behind him, and Nellie set Mrs. Garrison's dress aside and got to work on the coat. It was good canvas, she noted. Heavy and close woven, the kind that lasted years when it was cared for. The shoulder seam was the only real damage, though there were places along the cuffs where the stitching had thinned and would need reinforcing if the coat was going to last the season. She went over those too, working until the lamp oil was burning low and the town outside her window had gone quiet with the particular silence of a cattle town after 10 at night. Thursday came. Louis Haskins came with it, pushing through her door a few minutes past 9 in the morning with his hat already in his hand, which she noticed. Men who came to her shop did not usually bother with their hats. She handed him the coat. He put it on right there in the shop, which men sometimes did, pulling it over his shoulders and rolling them back to test the seam. She watched with the quiet satisfaction she always felt when a repair held exactly the way it was meant to. "That's good work," he said, and the way he said it was not the offhand compliment people gave when they were being polite. He sounded genuinely surprised. He moved his arm in a wide arc to test the shoulder, and the seam did not protest at all. "I reinforced the cuffs as well," she said. "No extra charge. They would have gone out within the month if I hadn't." He looked at her then, and something shifted in his expression, something she could not quite name. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't," she said. He paid her the 30 cents, counted out carefully from a worn leather pouch, and he was almost to the door when he stopped and turned back around. "I might have something else needs fixing," he said. "If that's all right." "That's what I'm here for," she said. He nodded once and left, and she watched through the window as he crossed the street and mounted a horse that was tied up at the rail in front of the general store, a bay with a white star on its forehead, and rode south out of town at an easy lope. She thought nothing more of it. That was the first week. The second week, he came back on Tuesday with a pair of leather work gloves that had a split down the palm seam of the right one. It was not strictly a seamstress's work leather gloves, but Nellie had an awl and heavy wax thread, and she had done tougher repairs. She told him she could have them by Thursday. He nodded and went away. Thursday, he was back. She handed him the gloves. He put the right one on and flexed his fingers and said, "Perfect," with a quiet approval that she found herself paying attention to more than she should have. "Do you always test things on the spot?" she asked before she could think better of it. He looked at her, that creekwater brown gaze that was direct without being aggressive. "Only when the work is worth testing," he said. She looked back at him steadily. "That's a reasonable policy." The faintest trace of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. Almost. He paid, tipped his hat, and left. The third week, it was a canvas saddlebag that had split at one of its bottom corners. She repaired it with a double-stitched reinforced seam and a small patch of matching canvas she happened to have on hand from a previous job. He tested that too, pressing his fingers against the patch and the seam from both sides. The fourth week, a flannel shirt with a torn elbow. The fifth week, a vest with a button missing and the buttonhole fraying. By the sixth week, Nellie had begun to suspect that Louis Haskins was manufacturing reasons to return to her shop. It was not a conclusion she reached quickly or easily, because She was not a woman given to presumptuous thinking about men. But she was also not a foolish woman, and by the time he appeared on a Tuesday morning in May with a perfectly intact neckerchief that he claimed needed its hem redone, she set the neckerchief on her counter and looked at him squarely. "Mr. Haskins," she said. "Ma'am," he said. His hat was in his hands again. "That neckerchief does not need its hem redone," she said. "The hem on that neckerchief is fine." He looked at the neckerchief. Then he looked at her. A long, quiet beat of silence passed between them in the cedar-smelling air of her shop. "No," he said finally, "it doesn't." "Then why are you here?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment that stretched out like taffy, and she could see something working behind his eyes, something being weighed. Louis Haskins was not a man, she had come to understand in these weekly installments, who spoke carelessly. Every word he offered seemed to have been considered before it was extended. "I like coming here," he said at last. It was simple and unadorned and honest, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest with a weight she had not expected. She picked up the neckerchief and folded it once neatly and handed it back to him. "Then come here," she said, "but not with a perfectly good neckerchief and a made-up story about the hem." The corner of his mouth moved then, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him. Not wide and performative, but real and unhurried, the kind that started at the eyes. It made him look younger and warmer and considerably more dangerous to her peace of mind. "That's fair," he said. She turned back to her workbench before she could do something foolish like smile back at him too visibly. "I'm open Tuesday through Saturday, 9 to 6. You're welcome to stop in." She heard the bell ring and then the door close, and she pressed her palm flat against the cool wood of her worktable and breathed out slowly. This, she thought, was going to require some careful management. She found out more about him over the following weeks, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small things, the way you learn about a country by walking it rather than looking at a map. He was 30 years old, born in Missouri, and had come west when he was 19 with a cattle operation. He worked for a man named Grantley out of the Texas Panhandle. He had eventually saved enough to buy a small stake in a horse breeding operation with 2 partners south of Caldwell, which was why he came through town regularly. He was not a drifter, she was relieved to learn, though she could not have said precisely when his drifting or not drifting had begun to matter to her. He had a way of sitting on the stool she kept near the counter, the one clients used when they needed to wait, that was specific to him. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees and his hat between his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way other men worried a coin, and he talked to her while she worked. Not about nothing. Real things. He told her about a horse he was training that had a mean streak left over from being badly started by its previous owner. He told her about a disagreement he had with one of his partners about the grazing rotation. He told her once, almost offhandedly, that he had not had a conversation worth remembering in a long time, and she had kept her eyes on her sewing because she did not want him to see what that did to her face. She told him things too, eventually. About her Aunt Margaret, who had taught her to sew, and who had been the funniest person Nellie had ever known. A small, sharp woman who could make you laugh until your sides ached, and then cut you dead with one precise observation. About the father she had lost. About the Ohio mother she wrote to twice a year, and who wrote back with letters full of news about a life that felt increasingly foreign. About the things she loved, fabrics with weight and drape, the specific quiet of early morning before a town woke up, the way a finished seam looked when everything had gone exactly right. "Do you ever think about leaving Caldwell?" he asked one afternoon in late June, while she was letting out the waist on a pair of trousers that belonged to the banker, Mr. Whitfield, whose prosperity was showing. "Where would I go?" she said, genuinely curious about her own answer. "Anywhere," he said. "Somewhere bigger, maybe. Somewhere they'd really appreciate what you can do." She looked up at him. "They appreciate it here." "Not the way they should," he said, and he said it quietly, almost privately, as if he were stating something factual rather than offering a compliment. She held the banker's trousers in her lap and studied him for a moment. The afternoon light came through her front window at an angle and caught the line of his jaw and the serious set of his eyes, and she thought that Louis Haskins was probably one of the most genuinely decent men she had ever met, which was a thing that frightened her considerably. It was easier, she had found, not to want things, easier not to build on uncertain ground. She had watched women in Caldwell marry cowboys who were here one season and gone the next, who loved the prairie more than any four walls, who came home with weather-beaten hands and wind-empty eyes. She had promised herself she would not be one of those women, that she would not give her heart to something that moved. But Louis came back. Every week he came back. And by the time July arrived, hot and relentless as a blacksmith's forge, she had stopped pretending she did not watch the clock on Tuesday mornings. It was the heat of July that changed things, or rather it was what the heat produced, which was the town picnic and celebration that Caldwell held every summer at the edge of the creek south of town, where the cottonwoods threw good shade, and the women brought enough food to feed the entire Kishom Trail. It was a Sunday, and Nellie had planned to go and stay no more than 2 hours, because there were 3 garments in her shop waiting to be finished, and the pleasant social commotion of Caldwell's citizens gathered in one place for any length of time was known to wear at her. She was arranging her contribution, a covered dish of spiced peaches she had put up the previous fall, when she saw Louis Haskins coming along the creek bank toward the gathered blankets and tables. He was not with anyone. He wore a clean white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and his good hat, the brown one without the trail dust on it, and he moved through the crowd with the comfortable self-possession of a man who was not looking for anyone in particular, until he saw her. The shift in his expression was subtle enough that probably no one else in the crowded field noticed it. His pace did not change. But something in his face settled, the way a compass needle settles when it finds north, and his direction became toward her as naturally as water finds its level. "Miss Yates," he said, coming up beside her. He looked at the dish in her hands. "Spiced peaches. From last year's harvest," she said. "Do you like peaches?" "I like most things," he said. "Can I carry that for you?" She let him take the dish, which felt like a surrender of some minor kind, and they walked together toward the tables where the other contributions were being arranged. And she was aware with some dismay that several of the women she knew were watching this progression with expressions of lively interest. They spent most of the afternoon together, not by any explicit arrangement, but because when she sat down on the blanket she had spread near the creek edge, he sat beside her, and when she went to get lemonade, he went along, and it felt entirely natural even though nothing about her internal state was natural at all. She felt alert and warm and conscious of the distance between his shoulder and hers in a way that was deeply inconvenient. "You don't dance," she observed, watching the space near the fiddle player where several couples had formed up for a reel. Others were watching Louis with expressions of expectation, the kind that suggested they had already formed opinions about his relationship to the woman beside him. "I can dance," he said. "You're not dancing," she said. He turned his head and looked at her directly, and the brown quietness of his eyes in the afternoon light was something she had to look away from. "I'd dance if I had the right reason," he said. "What's the right reason?" she asked, and she heard the slight catch in her own voice and hated it immediately. "Being asked by the right person," he said. He was not looking away. "Would you like to dance, Miss Yates?" She set down her lemonade cup very carefully. "I believe I would," she said. They danced 2 reels and a waltz. She had not danced a waltz in 3 years and had forgotten what it felt like, how the closeness of it made something loosen in your chest that you had spent a long time keeping tightly held. Louis danced with a quiet sureness that she recognized as characteristic, no showmanship, no performance, just steady and present and capable. His hand at her waist was warm through the fabric of her dress, and she was glad she was not the kind of woman who was easily flustered because she was, in fact, considerably flustered. When the music stopped and they stepped apart, he did not let go of her hand immediately. He held it for a moment in both of his and looked at her with an expression so earnest it made her chest ache. "Nellie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice was somehow different from the sound of it in anyone else's, particular and careful and almost reverent. "I'd like to take you for supper this week, properly, not in the shop." She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the fiddle had started again and couples were reforming, and the sound of summer and voices and children calling along the creek was everything the world contained. "I'd like that," she said. He smiled then, the full honest smile she had first seen 6 weeks ago in her shop, and it hit her with the same force it had then, maybe more. Wednesday evening, he came to the shop door at 6, exactly as the clock above her counter turned the hour, which told her something about him that she already knew. He was wearing the coat she had fixed the very first week, the brown canvas one, which she found so unexpectedly moving that she had to turn and collect her shawl from the hook to give herself a moment. He took her to the Frontier House, which was Caldwell's best dining room, not that Caldwell had many, but the Frontier House had white tablecloths and candles on the tables and a cook who had come from somewhere civilized. They had roast beef and roasted potatoes, and a pie that was more ambition than execution, and they talked for 2 hours without any sense of the time passing. She learned things about him that the Tuesday shop visits had not yet offered. That he had a younger sister named Clara in Missouri, who he wrote to faithfully and worried about often, Clara being married to a man that Louis described with careful neutrality and a pressed-together expression that said considerably more than his words. That he had a habit of reading when he could get his hands on books, which was not as often as he would like. That he had once, years ago, wanted to own his own spread outright and run cattle under his own brand, and still did, quietly, in the way people keep a hope alive by not speaking about it too often. She told him that she had once, in the year after her aunt died, very seriously considered giving up the shop and going back to Ohio, and had ultimately decided against it not because she was certain it was right, but because retreat felt dishonest. She told him that she was sometimes lonely in Caldwell in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people around her, a distinction she had never articulated to anyone before. He listened to that last thing, the way he listened to everything she said, with his whole attention, not waiting for a pause so he could speak, but actually receiving what she gave him. When she finished, he said simply, "I understand that kind," and she believed him completely. Walking her back to the shop after supper, they went slowly despite the heat having finally broken, and the evening air being the particular sweetness that July evenings sometimes offered on the Kansas plain. Stars had come out overhead, thick and close the way they were out here where there was no city light to thin them, and their boots were quiet on the packed dirt of the street. At her door, he stopped and turned toward her. In the yellow light that came through the shop window from the lamp she had left burning, she could see his face clearly, and what was in it was something patient and real that she recognized with a start, because she was fairly certain the same thing was in her own. "I'll see you Tuesday," he said. "You'll see me Tuesday," she agreed. He reached out and very briefly, very gently, touched her cheek with the back of 2 fingers. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, and she stood in the doorway of her shop and watched him go and felt something shift inside her that she understood was permanent, the way the movement of earth is permanent and cannot be undone. August arrived, and with August came complications, the way complications always seem to choose the warmest months. Louis came to the shop that first Tuesday of August with the brown canvas coat again, this time with a different damage, a long score along the back where something had caught it. But he also came with a gravity in his face that was new, something held tight beneath the surface. She took the coat and looked at him. "What's wrong?" she asked. He sat on the stool and turned his hat in his hands, the slow rotation she knew well by now. "One of my partners is pulling out," he said. "Wade Prout. He's got a brother in Colorado with a silver claim, wants to go in on it. He wants his share of the horse operation bought out." "Can you buy him out?" she asked. "If I spend everything I've got put aside," he said, "and take on the other third with my other partner, Amos, Between us we could swing it, but it would be lean for a while, a long while. And the horses are worth it." He looked at her steadily. "I think so, I know so, but it's a risk." She set the coat on the counter and folded her hands. "Then it sounds like you already know what you want to do," she said. Something in his expression shifted. "I wanted to talk it through with someone whose judgment I trust," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Your judgment is sound, Louis. If you believe in the horses, trust that." He nodded slowly. "My mother used to say something like that," he said. "She said the only thing that costs more than a wrong decision is an honest one you didn't make." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Nellie said. "She was," he said quietly. She understood then that his mother was gone too, and something in the shared landscape of that loss passed between them without requiring words. She picked up the coat and began to examine the scoring on the back, and he stayed on the stool, and they talked about other things, lighter things. And when he left that afternoon, there was something settled about him that had not been there when he arrived. He bought outweighed Prout's share. He told her about it the following Tuesday, and she could see the relief and the weight of it both, the way a man looks when he has committed to something irrevocable and found it both terrifying and right. His eyes were clearer, though. Whatever the cost, the clarity was worth it. The weeks continued. The coat was ready Thursday, as always. He tested the back seam with both hands, pulling gently, and nodded his approval, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of it and also something else, something warmer and deeper, which was the understanding that his approval had come to mean something to her on grounds that had nothing to do with professional pride. It was in September, with the first breath of autumn coming down from the north and the cottonwoods beginning to turn along the creek, that she found out about Rose Pemberton. Rose Pemberton was 31 years old, a widow of 2 years whose husband had run a dry goods store in Caldwell before his heart gave out, and she was handsome and capable, and had been received into certain social circles that Nellie, as a shopkeeper, occupied only peripherally. The information about Rose Pemberton came from Dora Caldwell, no relation to the town, who ran the millinery and who knew everything about everyone, and dispensed this knowledge with the cheerful indiscrimination of a sower broadcasting seed. "Rose Pemberton has set her cap for that horseman of yours," Dora said one morning in September, appearing in Nellie's doorway with a bolt of ribbon she claimed she needed altered, though really she needed to talk. "You know Rose. When she decides something, she doesn't play around." Nellie continued pinning the garment she was working on. "Louis Haskins is not my horseman," she said, with more composure than she felt. "Honey," Dora said, "he has been in this shop every single week for 3 months." "He has mending," Nellie said. Dora gave her a look of such profound, patient skepticism that Nellie had to look down at her pins. "He danced with you at the July picnic," Dora said. "He took you to the frontier house. Everyone saw." "Dora," Nellie said, "I'm just saying Rose Pemberton is going to make her move, and if you do nothing, you will spend the next 50 years repairing strangers' coats and being a damn fool about it." Nellie set her pins down. She looked at Dora Caldwell across the shop with the particular sharpness that she sometimes directed outward when internal chaos required a focus point. "Did it occur to you," she said, "that perhaps what Louis Haskins does with himself is his own business?" "Yes," Dora said. "And did it occur to you that what you feel about it is yours?" She set the bolt of ribbon on the counter. "The red," she said. "I'll take the red." Nellie cut the red ribbon. After Dora left, she sat very still for a moment in the quiet of her shop and was honest with herself in the way she had trained herself to be, which required pushing aside every comfortable half-truth and sitting with what was actually true. What was actually true was that she loved Louis Haskins. She had not planned to, had in fact specifically planned against it, but it had happened the way seasons happen, not suddenly but by accumulation, until one day the thing was unmistakably present, and you could not remember exactly when it had begun. She loved his quietness and his steadiness and the way he listened. She loved that he had kept coming back. She loved that he had worn the coat she fixed on the night he took her to supper. What was also true was that she had said nothing, had let the weeks pass with their comfortable warmth and had told herself it was enough, that she did not need more. That was fear, she acknowledged, dressed up as contentment. It was the thing she had always done, chosen the manageable life over the wanted one, because the wanted one required risk. She picked up her needle and went back to work, but her mind was working at something underneath. Louis came that Tuesday with a pair of dungarees with a ripped knee, which was at least a genuine repair. He sat on the stool and they talked about the weather turning and the horses and a piece about the railroad that someone had left him in a newspaper. She examined the dungarees and said she could have them by Thursday. He nodded. He was almost to the door, hat on, when she said his name. He turned around. She was standing behind her counter with her hands flat on the surface and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "Louis," she said, "are you courting me?" He was very still for a moment. Then he came back across the shop toward her, slowly, the way he did everything, without haste but with complete intention. He stopped on the other side of the counter and looked at her. "I'm trying to," he said. "I wasn't certain you wanted me to." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle that meant it was past 3 o'clock, and somewhere outside a wagon was crossing Main Street, and the cedar smell of the shop was around them both. "I do," she said. It was the simplest and most terrifying thing she had ever said. The expression that moved through his face was not the quiet, almost smile she was accustomed to. It was something much larger, genuine and warm and unguarded, and it turned him into something so open and real that she had to look down at the counter for a moment. "Then I'll court you properly," he said. "You've been coming here every week for 3 months," she said. "You've already been doing it improperly for quite some time." That made him laugh. Not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh, and it was a beautiful sound, the kind you wanted to collect and keep, and she was smiling before she could help it. "Thursday," she said. "Come Thursday for the dungarees and we can walk somewhere after." "Thursday," he agreed. He tipped his hat and left, and she pressed both hands against her face and stood there for a long moment in the good trouble of it. Rose Pemberton, as it turned out, did make her move, but by the time she did, Louis Haskins was already calling on Nellie Yates with the clear and visible intention of a man who had decided. He brought her wildflowers in September that he had picked along the creek road, which was something she might have expected from a younger or more theatrical man, but not from him. And yet when he handed them to her, a rough handful of late-blooming goldenrod and aster wrapped in brown paper, it was entirely natural and right. He took her riding one Saturday afternoon when the sky was an impossible shade of autumn blue, and she was a passable enough rider to keep up with him, and they followed the creek south through the cottonwoods until the town was entirely out of sight, and it was only the two of them and the horses and the turning leaves. He told her, that afternoon, about his father. It was something he had not spoken of in her shop, all those Tuesdays. His father had been a hard man, not a cruel one, but the kind whose distance was so complete that growing up beside him was like growing up beside a mountain, permanently present, never warm. Louis had left Missouri in part because of the distance the West put between himself and that particular mountain, and he said this without bitterness, only with the recognition of a man who had spent enough years thinking about a thing to have arrived at some peace with it. "I decided a long time ago," he said, "that whatever I built I was going to build it differently." They were stopped at the edge of the creek, their horses drinking. The cottonwood leaves were gold above them, catching light. "Differently how?" she asked. He considered it. "Warmer," he said. "I wanted whatever I had to be warm." She looked at the creek moving over its stones, the shallow, clear water. "I think you've managed that," she said quietly. He looked at her, and she could feel the weight and the meaning of his gaze on the side of her face. "I'm still working on it," he said. October arrived. Nellie was measuring out fabric for a new dress for herself, which she rarely did, always too busy making things for others, when she made a decision that surprised her even as she made it. The dress was going to be blue. A deep, real blue, the color of the sky in late October, the color that she had always liked and never allowed herself. She bought 6 yards of good wool serge from the mercantile and brought it back to the shop and hung it over the dress form and looked at it. It felt like something, like choosing something for yourself after a long time of choosing things for other people. Louis noticed the blue fabric when he came Tuesday. He stopped in the middle of the shop and looked at it on the form, and then he looked at her. "Is that for you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, with a conviction that was out of proportion to a length of fabric, and she understood that he understood. She finished the dress in 2 weeks, sewing in the evenings when the shop was closed, and when she wore it the first time on a Sunday to church. Louis Haskins, who had begun appearing at the small Methodist church on Sundays with a regularity that corresponded precisely to her own attendance, turned his head when she came through the door and looked at her with an expression that she was going to carry with her for the rest of her life. It was in November, with the first real cold coming down and the cattle trailing north having mostly ended for the season, that he came to the shop on a Tuesday and stayed until closing time. They had done that increasingly, him staying until she closed and then walking with her to the boarding house for supper, sharing meals with the other residents there with the easy comfort of a habit long established. But this Tuesday he stayed after helping her close the shutters, and she lit the lamp on the counter and they sat together in the warm amber light, she on her work stool and he on the client's stool, knee to knee across the narrow space of her workbench. He was turning his hat in his hands. She watched it go around. "I've been thinking," he said. "You do a lot of that," she said gently. "I have something I want to say, and I want to say it right," he said. She folded her hands and waited, her heart doing something ungovernable. "I know it hasn't been all that long," he said, "and I know you're a woman who thinks carefully about things, and I respect that. I respect it more than I can say." He looked down at his hat and then back up at her, and his eyes in the lamplight were warm and serious and entirely unguarded. "But I have known since about the 3rd week of coming here that I wanted to spend my life in the same place you were. And I know that's a big thing to say to a woman who has built something entirely her own and doesn't need anyone handing her anything." "Louis," she said softly, "I'm not asking you to give anything up," he said. "I'm asking you to let me be part of it, whatever it is. The shop, Caldwell, all of it. I want to build the warm thing I told you about, and I want to build it with you." He stopped. His jaw was tight with the effort of having said all of that. "If you'd have me," he added. The lamp oil crackled softly. Outside, the November wind moved against the shutters. The shop smelled of cedar and lavender and the faint lanolin of the wool she had been working with that afternoon. Nellie Yates looked at Louis Haskins across the narrow space of her workbench and felt everything inside her go quiet, the way weather goes quiet sometimes before something very large arrives. She had been afraid of this. Of exactly this, the having of it, because things you have can be lost in ways that things you haven't reached for cannot. But she was tired of the careful management. She was tired of the safe distance. She was 31 years old and she was in love with a steady, honest man who wore her repairs with pride and listened to her the way nobody else ever had. And the alternative to saying yes was a future she could now clearly see and did not want. "Yes," she said. It came out with an evenness she did not entirely feel, but the word was true and whole. He was very still for a moment, as if confirming he had heard correctly. Then he leaned forward across the workbench and took her hands in both of his, her seamstress hands with their small needle-prick scars and the callus at her right index finger, and he held them carefully. "I'll do right by you, Nellie," he said. "That I can promise." "I know you will," she said, and she did. He did not produce a ring that night, which was correct, because Louis Haskins was the kind of man who did things in the right order. He came back 3 days later with a ring he had ordered from the jeweler in Wichita, a simple gold band with a small oval of turquoise set in it, the stone the color of the sky that she loved, and she thought that he had paid attention to what she wore and what she liked in a way that even she had not entirely registered until this moment. She said yes again, more emphatically the second time. The word went through Caldwell the way words always went through Caldwell, faster than weather and with more editorial commentary. Dora Caldwell came by the shop within 12 hours to say she had seen it coming since July and was gratified to have been right. Mrs. Garrison brought a cake. The barber next door, a taciturn man named Henderson who had said perhaps 15 words to Nellie in 3 years, appeared in her doorway to say congratulations with the air of someone who had rehearsed it and was relieved to have it done. They were married in December, 3 days before Christmas, in the Methodist church that they had both been attending on Sunday mornings with their separate but aligned intentions. The church was decorated with cedar boughs and candles, and the temperature outside was genuinely cold for Kansas, with a thin skin of snow on the ground that caught the candlelight through the windows and turned the street outside silver. Nellie wore the blue wool dress. She had added a white collar to it, fine white lawn that she had put on with stitches so small you could barely see them, and she had done her dark hair up in a way that was more elaborate than her usual practical arrangements, coiled at the back of her neck with 2 small combs of tortoiseshell that had belonged to her Aunt Margaret. She carried a handful of dried flowers from the summer, goldenrod and aster, the same ones Louis had brought her in September, pressed and kept. Louis wore his good suit, dark brown wool, and his good hat, and he stood at the front of the church and watched her come up the aisle with an expression on his face that she heard described afterward by 3 separate people as the most unguarded thing they had ever seen on a man in public. She thought that was probably right. He looked at her the way the morning looks at the first light, as if it has been waiting and is not going to pretend otherwise. The minister, Reverend Eames, performed a ceremony that was brief and sincere and exactly right, and when Louis Haskins said, "I will," in his low, unhurried voice, it had the sound of a thing that had been true before it was spoken. When Nellie said it, she said it clearly, looking directly at him, because she had decided to do this without flinching in any direction. He kissed her at the close of it, gentle and warm and entirely present, and around them the small congregation of Caldwell's citizens applauded with the particular warmth of a community that has watched something grow in their midst and is glad to see it flower. The reception was at the Frontier House, where they had had their first supper together, which had been Nellie's quiet joke to herself about circles. The town came, or most of it, and the proprietor of the Frontier House had produced a wedding cake of 3 tiers that was more ambitious than his pie had ever been and considerably more successful. There was music from the same fiddle player who had played at the July picnic, and Louis danced with her twice and did not need any convincing this time. They had arranged to live in the rooms above the shop, which were larger than people assumed from the outside, and which Louis had quietly spent 2 weeks making better before the wedding, adding a stove vent and repairing a window that had always had a draft, and building a set of shelves in the main room for her fabrics and her books, the shelves made from good wood he had brought himself, sanded smooth. She had not known about the shelves until the morning after the wedding when she went into the main room above the shop and found them there, and she stood and looked at them for a long moment and then sat down on the step and put her head in her hands for a minute until she had herself back together. "Too much," he said from the doorway, sounding genuinely concerned. "Not enough," she managed, which did not make immediate sense but which he understood entirely. The winter was good. It was the particular goodness of a winter when you are where you want to be with the person you want to be with, when the cold outside makes the inside sweeter, when the sound of wind against the windows is pleasant rather than lonely. Louis came and went to the horse operation, a ride of several hours south, and returned on Thursdays or Fridays each week with the reliable steadiness she had come to count on. She ran the shop and built her clientele and sewed in the evenings with the lamp turned up and Louis reading across the room, their domestic quiet so easy and natural that she sometimes caught herself marveling at it. She wrote to her mother in Ohio, a longer letter than usual, and her mother wrote back with warmth that surprised her, 3 pages instead of the usual one, expressing happiness for her daughter in terms that suggested she had been worried about Nellie for some years. Nellie read that letter twice and then put it in the small box where she kept important things. Louis wrote to his sister Clara in Missouri, a long letter that he showed Nellie before he sent it, which made her understand how much he trusted her judgment. The letter about Clara's husband, the one with careful neutrality and the pressed-together expression, had been weighing on him. Clara wrote back that she was well, thank you, and was glad Louis had found someone good. The way she said "found someone good" rather than anything more specific about the marriage made Louis quiet for an evening, but he did not spiral into it, which Nellie respected. Spring came in through the cracks of the shop with its insistence, and with it came a change in Nellie herself that she recognized first in small ways, and then in one very large and unmistakable way. She told Louis on an evening in early April, sitting across from him at the table above the shop with their supper between them, the straightforward way she tended to deliver important things. "I'm going to have a child," she said. He went very still, the way he did when something required a moment of internal adjustment. She watched his face carefully and saw the stillness give way to something so bright and open it almost made her shy. "When?" he said. "October, I think," she said. He stood up from the table and came around to her, and he crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in the same way he had taken them across the workbench the night he had told her everything, and he looked up at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but fine." "You'll tell me when you're not fine," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "I will." He pressed his forehead against the back of her hands for a moment, and she felt the warm weight of his breath against her skin, and she understood that what she had described as building the warm thing was being built, right now, in the rooms above a seamstress's shop in Caldwell, Kansas, between two people who had found each other by way of a torn coat and a great deal of Tuesday mornings. The pregnancy was not simple, particularly in the summer months when the Kansas heat was at its most suffocating, and she was at her most unwieldy. But she was a practical woman and she managed. She hired a girl named Lucy, 14 years old with quick fingers, to help in the shop with the simpler work, and she slowed her own pace without stopping entirely. She was still sewing in September, though she had moved the work stool to a more comfortable position and taken to propping her feet when she sat for long periods. Louis was careful with her without being hovering, which was the correct balance, and one she had been mildly afraid he might not find, but he found it. He did more of the hauling and fetching without comment. He began coming home from the horse operation more frequently, sometimes in the middle of the week on days he previously would have stayed south. He did not say this was because of her. He said it was because there was a particular mare that needed close watching. The mare was entirely healthy as far as Nellie could determine from the reports. She loved him for the pretense. Their son was born on the 23rd of October, which was earlier than the October she had said, it turning out to be early rather than late, and he arrived with considerable urgency and with Louis present, which Nellie had stipulated. The doctor, old Dr. Hart, had looked somewhat doubtful about the husband's presence in the room, but Louis Haskins, in a state of quiet and unmovable determination, was not a man who could be redirected by a doubtful look, so the doctor had accepted the situation and gotten on with his business. The child came into the world at 2 in the morning with the voice of someone who had opinions and intended to share them, and he was red and astonishingly loud and perfect in the way only very new people are, when the world has not yet had time to tell them anything about themselves. Louis held him first, because Nellie's hands were shaking and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to her foundations, and he held the baby with both hands and looked at him with an expression that completed something. She watched her husband hold their son, and she felt something so large move through her that it had no name, only the sense of arrival, of having arrived, of being fully in the right place at the right time with the right person. "What do we call him?" Louis said, not looking away from the baby. "James," she said. She had decided this weeks ago. James had been her father's name, the man lost at the Missouri River. "James Haskins," Louis said, trying the sound of it. He looked up at her. "That's a good name." "It's a good name for a good person," she said. James Haskins was, in fact, a person who immediately took it upon himself to determine what everyone around him was capable of. He slept in loud disagreement with regular intervals and ate with serious devotion, and spent his waking hours with his eyes moving around the world with an attention that she recognized as somewhat characteristic. He was dark-haired from the start and had Louis's quiet brown eyes, which was something she noticed with a private joy that she sometimes expressed and sometimes just held. The shop continued. She was back at her work stool within 6 weeks of James's birth, with Lucy promoted to a proper assistant's position, and she fed James between customers and sewed with him, sleeping in the basket beside the workbench. And the women of Caldwell who came in often stayed longer than they strictly needed to, because the shop with Nellie and the baby in it had a quality of warmth that was hard to leave. The year turned, and 1879 arrived, and with it came the kind of slow, steady accumulation that happy years consist of. James learned to sit, and then to pull himself upright on the legs of the workbench, leaving small fingerprints in the sizing starch. Louis's horse operation with his partner Amos had a good year, the reputation of their stock spreading enough that buyers came from as far as Colorado. They were not wealthy, but they were stable, which felt like wealth of a different kind. Louis bought a small house on the north edge of Caldwell in the spring of 1879. Not large, but solid, with 3 rooms on the ground floor and a loft above, and a kitchen garden plot behind it that had good south-facing light. The house was 6 blocks from the shop, close enough to be practical and far enough to have a little peace from Main Street. They moved in on a Saturday in May, carrying their things in a wagon that Louis drove and Nellie directed, and James rode on the box seat between them with an expression of magnificent composure for a 7-month-old. The house needed things. Every house needs things. Nellie painted the inside walls a warm off-white and found curtain fabric she liked at the Mercantile, a small floral print in cream and soft blue, and put up curtains in the main room and the bedroom that made the house feel immediately inhabited and particular. Louis built a cradle out of good walnut wood, learning the joinery from a man in town who did furniture, and the cradle was beautiful in the unpretentious way that useful things made with care are beautiful. She planted the kitchen garden herself in May, with Louis helping her work the soil, and between them they had a competent if not expert understanding of what needed to go where, and by August the garden was producing tomatoes and beans and squash, with a generosity that kept them busy canning on weekend evenings. The tomatoes were particularly good, and she sent jars of them to Dora Caldwell, who had been right about everything and deserved acknowledgement of the fact. Dora received the tomatoes with a magnanimity that was only slightly superior. "I told you," she said, the one time, and then did not say it again, which was the correct amount. Louis's sister Clara came to visit in the fall of 1879. She arrived on the train from Missouri, a small woman with dark eyes like her brother and a directness to her that Nellie recognized immediately as family. Clara's husband had not come with her, which was noted without being commented on, and the 2 weeks she spent in Caldwell were good ones. Clara and Nellie took to each other in the way of women who recognize each other's intelligence and respect it without requiring explanation. They talked while Louis was at the horse operation, long conversations over coffee in the kitchen of the small house, about things that mattered and things that didn't, and Clara held James with the ease of someone who knew how to hold a baby, and looked at him with the particular fierce love of an aunt who intends to do her duty. When Clara left, she hugged her brother for a long time at the train station, and Louis held onto her with the patient love of someone who cannot fix what he would fix if he could, and only lets go when the thing requires it. Nellie stood a few steps back and watched this and felt the complexity of it, love mixed with helplessness, which was one of the hardest combinations. After the train left, Louis stood at the platform edge for a moment looking south along the tracks. Then he turned and came back to her, and she put her hand through his arm, and they walked back to the wagon with James on her hip. "She'll be all right," Nellie said. "She's strong," he said. "She'll be all right." It was not entirely believable, but it was what they had, and sometimes what you have is enough to get you through the present. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold, genuinely cold, the kind of Kansas winter that reminded you that the prairie had no mercy in its bones, and that walls and fire were not luxuries but necessities. The shop was warm because the small stove in the corner was kept going all day, and James, who was now walking, had developed a fascination with the stove's front door that required constant vigilance and gave Lucy something to do between alterations. He was a busy child, curious and specific in his curiosity, and he communicated his opinions about the world with increasing clarity and volume as language became available to him. Louis loved fatherhood in the way that he loved everything, completely and without drama. He read to James in the evenings before bed, from whatever book was to hand, which meant that James Haskins's first literary experience was a diverse and unpredictable one. Louis got down on the floor with him without being asked and pushed wooden horses across the boards, and taught him the names of things outdoors with the patient specificity of a man who believed the world deserved to be known accurately. James called him duh, and reached for him with the straightforward trust of a child who has never had reason to question whether his father will be there. By the spring of 1880, there were signs that the town of Caldwell was growing in the ways that cattle towns on the trail grew, with new businesses and new residents and new complications. The railroad spur talk that had been going around for 2 years was looking more serious, and with the railroad would come more commerce and more volatility both. There were tensions in the territory that everyone who paid attention knew were not going away, the pressure on the land, and on the people who had been on it longest, which was a conversation that Caldwell had quietly and sometimes not quietly. Nellie had served customers who represented various sides of those tensions, the ranchers and the homesteaders and the Cherokee and Osage people who came through with their own complex presences in the changed landscape of their territory. She had made garments for people whose lives intersected in the town, and whose histories were layered and often painful, and she listened in the way good listeners do, with attention and without pretense, and she understood more about the landscape she lived in than most because of it. Louis talked about these things with her, because he was a man who had moved across enough of the West to have seen enough of what was done to the land and its first peoples to have made him think seriously about it. And they agreed, most of the time, and when they did not, they argued in the productive way of two people who trust each other enough to mean it. In the early summer of 1880, Nellie realized she was expecting again. This time, the knowledge arrived with more ease than the first time, not because it was less significant, but because she was more certain of the ground she stood on. She told Louis over supper again, and he looked up at her with the immediate warmth and the immediate practical concern in the same expression. "October again," he said. "January, I think," she said. "Maybe February." "Good," he said. "Better weather than last time anyway." "Marginally," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and James, sitting in his chair between them with the remains of his supper, distributed democratically across himself and the chair, watched his parents with the serene incomprehension of a 21-month-old. This pregnancy was easier. She was less surprised by what her body required and more efficient about providing it. The shop ran well, Lucy having grown into a competent and reliable assistant who could handle most of the simpler alterations on her own. The baby moved in the winter months with a persistence that kept Nellie awake some nights, and Louis, who woke when she woke, made her tea and sat with her in the kitchen, while the cold pressed against the windows and James slept upstairs in the loft with his wooden horses. "Tell me something good," she said once at 2 in the morning in January, with the wind doing its worst outside and the baby doing something acrobatic within. He thought about it. "The bay mare foaled this week," he said. "First foal of the season, solid as anything. Amos says she's going to be something when she grows." "What color?" "Bay, like her mother. One white sock." "That's good," she said, and it was. Everything about it was good. The kitchen and the warmth and the tea and the wind outside that could not get in, and the man across from her who told her about good things at 2 in the morning because she had asked. Their daughter was born on the 4th of February, 1881, and she was small and fierce and pink, and she had Nellie's dark eyes. Louis looked at her in the way he had looked at James, with that brightness that had no performance in it, and he said, "Hello," to her in his low voice as if she were a person he had been expecting to meet. "Margaret," Nellie said, for her aunt, the small sharp woman who had laughed and taught her to sew. Louis looked at her. "Margaret Haskins," he said. "She looks like a Margaret." "I think so too," Nellie said. Margaret Haskins was, from the beginning, a person who knew what she wanted and moved toward it with calm efficiency, which was possibly the most accurate inheritance possible from both her parents. She was quieter than James had been as an infant, which was not silence but a focused kind of attention, and she watched the world with those dark eyes as if categorizing it. James received his sister with the complicated emotions of a 2-year-old, confronted with a permanent change to his circumstances, which involved a period of testing and a period of adjustment, and eventually, around the 3-month mark, an almost proprietary warmth, at which point he began following her progress across whatever surface she was lying on with the alert concern of a self-appointed guardian. The shop had a good year in 1881. The railroad had arrived by the fall of that year, and with it, a surge of commerce that meant more customers, a broader range of them, some passing through and some newly settled, and Nellie had hired a second assistant, a woman named Harriet who had come to Caldwell on the railroad herself. The shop had grown beyond simple mending and alterations, and she had begun accepting orders for made-to-measure garments, which was the direction she had always wanted to move, and which now seemed both possible and sustainable. Louis's horse operation had grown as well, the reputation of the stock strong enough now that Amos had proposed expanding the breeding program, and they had a conversation in the spring of 1881 about buying the land outright rather than leasing, which was the conversation Louis had told her about back in August of 1878, the one where he had said this might be lean for a while. It was not lean anymore. He had waited for the right time, and the right time had come. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1881, Nellie stood in the back of her shop with James on her hip and Margaret in the basket in the corner, and looked at the room around her. The fabric bolts in their organized rows on the shelves Louis had built, the dress forms with their current work, the 2 work tables where she and Lucy and Harriet moved through the days with competent hands, the sign outside that still said NYATES, though she had been Nellie Haskins for 3 years now and would update the sign in the spring. She thought about the Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878 when the bell above the door had rung, and she had told a tall man with road-worn hands that she would be with him directly. She thought about a brown canvas coat with a torn shoulder seam, and the 30 cents he had paid, and the cuffs she had reinforced without being asked. She thought about the neckerchief that did not need its hem redone. She thought about a man who came back every week with something new to fix, and then stopped pretending there was anything that needed fixing, and then came back anyway. She thought about what it meant to have your life become warm when you had spent so many years managing it into something careful and survivable but not warm. She thought about the shelves. She thought about the goldenrod pressed and carried at her wedding. She thought about "I like coming here," and "if you'd have me," and "that I can promise." She thought about 2 in the morning and tea and a bay foal with 1 white sock. Louis came through the back door of the shop at that moment, having come up from the street, and he stopped when he saw her expression, the way he always stopped when something needed understanding. "What is it?" he asked. She looked at him across the familiar small space of the room, this man who had first stood in her doorway 3.5 years ago with a coat that needed saving, this man who had come back every week with something new until the something new was himself. "Nothing," she said. "Everything is good." He looked at her for a moment with those steady brown eyes, reading her the way he had always read her, more carefully than anyone else she had known. Then he came across the room and took James from her hip, and James went to him with the uncomplicated ease of a child who does not have to think about whether he will be held, and Louis settled the boy on his arm and put his free hand at Nellie's waist and stood beside her. "Harriet said the dress for Mrs. Calloway is ready," he said. "It is," she said. "She picks it up Monday." "Good." He looked around the shop, the fabric and the forms and the good solid order of it. "You've built something real here," he said. "We've built something real," she said. He tilted his head slightly, considering this, and then nodded. "Fair enough," he said. The years that followed were the kind of years that people who have lived them describe as the best of their lives without being able to say precisely what made them so. Because what made them so was the accumulation of ordinary things held in a certain light. Louis bought the land outright in the spring of 1882 and expanded the horse breeding operation with a thoughtfulness and patience that was characteristic of him. Not fast but steady, the way things built to last are built. The horses that came from Haskins and Amos stock developed a reputation across the region that brought buyers from Kansas and Texas, and even once from as far as New Mexico territory. A cattleman who had heard from a man who had heard from another man. The shop became what Nellie had always understood it could become, the town's destination for quality work, for garments that were made right the first time and repaired right the second time, a place that women went not just for their mending, but for the particular quality of the conversation and the warmth of the space and the sense, when you were there, that your needs were being taken seriously. She added a line of ready-made garments, made in the shop during slow weeks, and sold from the rack she put near the front window, which was something new in Caldwell and which the railroad had made possible, having brought affordable fabric in quantities that would not have been practical by wagon. James started school in 1883 and applied himself with the seriousness he brought to everything. And the teacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Farrow, sent a note home in November saying that James Haskins had a particular aptitude for mathematics and they should encourage it. Louis showed Nellie the note, and she could see the pride in his face that he was being moderate about, which made her love him with a specific sharpness. Margaret, who was 3 by then and running the house, had determined that she wanted to learn to sew, a declaration she made to Nellie by appearing at the workbench one morning, dragging a footstool behind her, and climbing up onto it to watch with an expression of total intentness. Nellie looked at this small person standing at her elbow with dark eyes full of purpose and felt something enormous and delicate and warm. "All right," she said. "Come here and I'll show you how to thread a needle." It turned out to be something Margaret was genuinely good at, the threading. Once Nellie had found a needle large enough for small fingers and thread brightly colored enough to track. She sat beside her mother at the workbench on Saturday mornings when the shop was slow and practiced her stitches with the focused patience of someone who has decided to master something, which was very Margaret. On a Tuesday morning in the fall of 1884, which was 6 years and some months after a certain first Tuesday, Nellie was at her workbench working on a wedding dress for a woman named Vera Nash, who was marrying one of the young ranchers south of town, and the bell above the door rang. She did not look up immediately, because she was in the middle of a section of the bodice that required precise attention, and she had trained herself not to break her rhythm for a bell. "I'll be with you directly," she said. "Take your time," said Louis. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway in the brown canvas coat, which was, improbably, the same coat she had repaired that first Tuesday, so well mended over the years that it had become a matter of principle. He had something in his hands, a length of bridle leather that had cracked along a section and needed stitching. She set down the bodice and looked at the bridal leather and then at him. "Really?" she said. He set the bridal leather on the counter with a perfectly sober expression. "Thought you might be able to get to it by Thursday," he said. "Louis," she said. "It's a genuine repair," he said. "I actually do need it by Thursday." She picked up the bridal leather and examined the crack. She pressed her thumb along the split the way she always did with everything he brought her, assessing depth and severity and what it required. It was a genuine crack, real damage, real leather. "Thursday," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "What do you call it when a man brings his wife his mending?" she said. "Efficient," he said. She looked at him across the counter, this man who had stood in this doorway for the first time when she was 24, and he was 30 and the world was the particular shape it had been then, and who stood there now with 6 years of Tuesdays behind them and 2 children at home, and a house with curtains she had chosen and shelves he had built. And she felt the same thing she had felt in every week of those years, the same fundamental rightness of him. "I'll have it Thursday," she said. He tipped his hat, which he still did, which he would always do. "Much obliged, Miss Yates," he said, and she did not correct him because it was their thing and always would be, and he was already smiling properly before the door closed behind him. She sat for a moment with the bridal leather in her hands and the warm light of the October morning coming through the window and the sounds of Caldwell going about its business outside, and she thought that this was what a life was. Not the dramatic moments, though those had their place and their weight, but this, the returning. The steady, unremarkable, faithful returning, week after week, until the returning was the whole of what you had built, and it was something immense and warm and true. She picked up the wedding dress bodice and went back to her stitching. The bridal leather was ready Thursday, because it was always ready Thursday. Margaret sewed her first straight seam the following Saturday, a running stitch down a scrap of blue cotton, and held it up to show her father when he came home that evening, and Louis took it from her and examined it with the gravity of a man studying something important and said, "That's good work, Maggie," and she beamed with the complete satisfaction of someone who has been seen accurately. James, who was there, said, "I can do that too," which was probably not true but which nobody disputed. In the spring of 1885, Louis came home from the horse operation one Thursday evening with a particular look on his face, the one she had learned to recognize as the look of something he had been deciding whether to say. She waited him out over supper. "Amos wants to sell his share," he said finally. She looked at him. "His health?" she asked, because she had been watching Amos whenever he came to town and he had not looked fully well for some months. "Mostly. He wants to go to his daughter in Missouri, rest himself properly." Louis turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He offered me first purchase, which is what the agreement says. His share is fair priced. But it would mean running the whole thing myself, just me and the hands." "Can you run the whole thing yourself?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "I've been running most of it for 2 years." "Then what's the question?" He looked at her. "The money, we've got it, most of it, between the savings and what the shop's been bringing. But it would be tight for a year or so, and I wanted to talk to you before I said anything to Amos." "Louis," she said. "Nellie," he said. "Buy the horse operation," she said. "It's our money," he said. "Buy the horse operation," she said again. "You know these horses, you built this from the beginning. Amos has been the partner, but you've been the one, everyone knows it, buy it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. Then he looked at her, and what was in his eyes was the same thing she had seen in them on the stool across from her workbench that November evening in 1878, that patient, open, unguarded honesty. "You sure?" he said. "I was sure at breakfast," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it. He bought the operation from Amos in May of 1885, and Amos went to Missouri to his daughter, and they gave him a good send-off. Within the year, the Haskins horse operation was running under its own brand, a simple H in a circle, and Louis Haskins had the thing he had told her he wanted, the night beside the creek south of town with the cottonwoods going gold. Something built in his own name, on his own terms, in the place he had chosen. He did not say this explicitly, but he came home from the brand registration in Wichita with a kind of settled light about him that needed no explanation. She saw it and recognized it and felt the reflected warmth of it in her own chest. That was a year of many things. Nellie took on a third assistant, which the shop now genuinely required, a quiet and skilled young woman named Ada who had learned her trade from her grandmother in Virginia. The shop moved into larger premises at the end of the year, expanding sideways into the space next to the barber when Henderson the barber finally retired, which gave her a proper fitting room and a display area in the front and substantially more worktable space. She updated the sign. It said HASKINS, Seamstress and Made to Order, and she stood on the boardwalk and looked at it for a moment before the letters were fully dry and thought about the N. Yates' sign that had been there 7 years ago and what had grown in the space between. December of 1885 brought snow and Christmas and a letter from Clara in Missouri. The letter was brief and between its lines significant. Clara's husband had left. She was not elaborate about it, which was her way, but she said that she was well and that she had her 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, and that she was thinking about what came next. Louis read the letter twice at the table and then handed it to Nellie without speaking, which was his way of asking her to think with him. She read it and handed it back. "Write to her," she said. "Tell her to come." He looked at her. "Caldwell has room," she said. "The shop has room. She can sew, you told me she could sew. She can help here while she gets her feet under her." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a big thing to offer," he said. "Your family is not a big thing," she said. "It's just family." He wrote to Clara that evening. Clara came in February of 1886 with her 2 children, which were Thomas and Eliza, and Caldwell was in the grip of a proper Kansas winter and none of them cared at all. She was thinner than she had been when she visited in 1879, and there were things in her eyes that had been put there by years of a particular kind of difficulty. But she held herself upright and she looked around the house and the shop with those dark eyes so like her brother's, and she said, with a directness that was entirely familiar, "Thank you. I'm going to make myself useful." She was as good as her word. Clara worked in the shop with a competence and speed that Ada admired openly and Lucy respected professionally. And she had a particular gift for the made-to-order work that gave Nellie time to focus on the most complex garments. She found rooms 2 streets over and settled her children into the school where James was already making his way with his mathematical aptitude, and where Margaret would begin in the fall. Thomas and Eliza, after a period of wariness, discovered in James and Margaret something close enough to cousins that the distinctions became academic. Louis watched his sister settle with a quiet relief that he expressed by not expressing anything about it, which she understood completely. By the summer of 1886, the household they had built, the shop and the house and the extended circle of family and town, had a quality of completeness to it that was different from stillness. It was not still, any of it. The shop was busy and growing. The horse operation was expanding. The children were becoming themselves in the specific urgent ways of children who are understood, and the town of Caldwell was changing around them all, the era of the great cattle drives beginning to wind down as the railroad made them less necessary, the prairie being settled and fenced in ways that were changing the nature of the West itself. These changes were not all good and Nellie knew it. The world being remade around them came at costs that were borne unevenly, and she had not stopped paying attention to who paid those costs. But she also knew that her own square of it, the shop and the house and the people in them, was a place where things were done as rightly as she knew how to do them, and that had to count for something. On a Tuesday morning in August of 1886, which was the last hot week of a long hot summer, Nellie was at her main worktable finishing the final adjustments on a riding outfit for a woman from the new ranching family that had come up from Texas. Margaret, who was 5 and had been attending the shop on summer mornings with the authority of someone who had been invited, was on her footstool at the end of the table practicing her stitching. James was at the horse operation with his father, having reached the age of 8, at which he had informed everyone that he wanted to learn the horses, a declaration that Louis had received with his characteristic quiet warmth and acted on immediately. The bell above the door rang. Margaret looked up. Then she looked at her mother. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, correctly, having recognized the shadow through the front window. "Go let her in," Nellie said. Margaret climbed off her stool with great dignity and went to open the door for Mrs. Calloway, who came in for the alteration to her autumn coat that she had booked a week ago, and said good morning to Margaret in the way adults speak to children they find surprisingly composed, and then turned to Nellie at the work table. They discussed the coat, and Nellie pinned the alterations, and Margaret watched with her dark, focused eyes, and Mrs. Calloway left, and the bell rang again as the door closed. Margaret climbed back onto her stool and picked up her stitching. "Mama," she said, after a moment of focused needlework. "Yes," Nellie said. "Did Papa really used to bring things here to be fixed every week?" Nellie looked up. Margaret was applying her needle with complete seriousness and not looking up, as if the question were casual, which it was not, because nothing Margaret asked was casual. "He did," Nellie said. "What things?" Nellie smiled. "His coat first, then gloves, a saddlebag, a shirt, a vest." She paused. "Then a neckerchief that didn't actually need fixing." Margaret looked up from her stitching at this. "Why?" Nellie held her needle still for a moment. Through the window she could see the August light on Main Street, the same light that had been coming through this window for 8 years, the light she had been sitting in when she first told a tall stranger that she would be with him directly. "Because he liked coming here," she said, "and I liked him coming." Margaret considered this with the gravity of 5 years old. "So he pretended he had something to fix so he could come and see you." "For a while," Nellie said. "Did it work?" Margaret asked. Nellie looked at her daughter, this small, fierce person who had her eyes and her father's steadiness and no patience for anything that didn't make sense. "Yes," she said. "It worked." Margaret nodded, finding this satisfactory, and went back to her stitching with the air of someone who has filed away important information. Nellie watched her for a moment and then did the same. The bell rang at 3:30, when the afternoon was thinking about evening, and Louis came in from the street with James behind him. The boy, sunburned and cheerful, with the look of someone who had had exactly the day he wanted. Louis had James's hat in his hand, because James had left it somewhere again, and Louis's brown canvas coat was over his arm in the August heat, because even he could not wear it in this weather, but he had brought it because the pocket had pulled loose at the lining, and he had thought, since he was coming past the shop, he would leave it for repair. He set the coat on the counter. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Really?" she said. "The pocket lining," he said. She picked up the coat and turned it inside out and found the pocket lining, which had indeed come loose. A small, honest repair needed, just as he said, and she smoothed it between her fingers. "Thursday," she said. He smiled. The full, honest smile that had started at his eyes 8 years ago and had not changed at all, only deepened with use. "I know," he said. James had gone directly to the end of the work table where Margaret was stitching, and was now looking over her shoulder with the critical eye of an older brother who had decided to evaluate her work. And Margaret was not looking at him, but had straightened her back in the particular way that said she was aware of his opinion, and was indifferent to it, but also not entirely indifferent. Louis came around the counter to where Nellie was standing, and she handed him back the coat, which he draped over his arm, and he stood beside her looking at their children at the end of the work table, the boy with his mathematical mind and his grandfather's name and his father's eyes, the girl with her needle and her dark gaze and the name of the woman who had taught this all to begin with. "Good day?" he asked quietly, so only she could hear. "Good day," she said. He put his free arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him for a moment, the way she had learned to lean, without calculation or management, just because she wanted to and because he was there, and because this was the warm thing, this right here, all of it, the whole improbable, beautiful, ordinary construction of it. The coat was ready Thursday. It was always ready Thursday. And Louis Haskins came for it, the way he came for everything, steadily and with his whole intention. And when he walked through the door of the shop that had been hers first and was now theirs in the way that things belong to people who have built them together, he tipped his hat to the woman behind the counter, and she looked at him with the same eyes she had always looked at him with, clear and direct and unafraid. "Mr. Haskins," she said. "Miss Yates," he said. And the bell above the door rang, and the cedar-smelling shop held them. And outside on Main Street, Caldwell, Kansas went about the business of its ordinary, extraordinary days. And it was enough. It was everything. It was the whole warm world they had chosen and been chosen by, built stitch by careful stitch from a torn coat on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878.